On the morning of July 15th, in the Belgorod region of Russia, a small remote-controlled aircraft worth a few $100s appears to have brought down a helicopter that cost the Russian state somewhere between $15 and $19 million to build. That is the claim now circulating out of Kyiv, and it is worth slowing down on because if it holds up, it is not just another battlefield headline, it is another data point in what may be the most consequential shift in modern warfare since the machine gun forced infantry into trenches. The claim itself is straightforward. Ukraine's unmanned systems forces say that fighters from the 427th Separate Unmanned Systems Regiment, known by its call sign Rarog, struck and destroyed a Russian Mi-28 Night Hunter attack helicopter near the settlement of Vyazovoye in Belgorod region at around 10 in the morning local time. The announcement came from the commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, Robert Brovdy, who goes by the call sign Madyar, a name that has become almost synonymous with Ukraine's drone war over the past 2 years. Brovdy posted footage of the engagement on his Telegram channel, describing the helicopter in his usual dry and mocking tone as going nose first into the dirt. He credited the strike to what he called the birds of the 427th Brigade, using the informal shorthand that Ukrainian drone units have adopted for themselves throughout this war, treating their aircraft almost as living things, hunters released into the sky to track down prey. Let's establish what we actually know and then get into what it means. The target was a Mi-28, NATO reporting name Havoc, known inside Russia by the nickname Night Hunter for its night vision and all-weather targeting systems. It is a dedicated attack helicopter developed in the Soviet Union in the 1980s as a rival to the American Apache, and it did not actually enter frontline Russian service until the 2000s, decades after its first prototype flew. It is built to hunt tanks, armored vehicles, and troop concentrations, and to do so while surviving substantial ground fire. It carries a 30mm automatic cannon mounted under its nose, along with a mix of guided anti-tank missiles and unguided rocket pods, and it is protected by armor plating around the cockpit designed specifically to withstand hits from heavy machine guns and light autocannons. In other words, this is not a fragile transport helicopter or an unarmed reconnaissance platform. It is one of the most heavily protected rotary wing aircraft in the Russian inventory, purpose-built to absorb punishment on a conventional battlefield, and according to Ukrainian reports, it was brought down anyway, not by a missile, not by a fighter jet, not by ground-based air defense, but by an inexpensive first-person view drone flown by an operator sitting somewhere behind the front line, watching a video feed through a pair of goggles. That detail is the heart of the story, and it is worth explaining clearly because the phrase FPV drone gets thrown around so often now that its significance can get lost. A first-person view drone is essentially a small quadcopter, often not much bigger than a dinner plate, fitted with a forward-facing camera that transmits a live video signal back to the operator in real time. The operator flies it the way a fighter pilot would fly a jet, watching the world rush past through the drone's own eyes, making split-second adjustments as the target moves. These systems were originally adapted from the hobbyist racing drone community, repurposed early in the war for cheap, precise strikes on tanks, trucks, and dugouts. What they were never originally designed to do was hit something moving through open air at more than 200 kilometers an hour. A ground vehicle, however fast, is still tethered to the terrain, following roads, slowing at obstacles, predictable in 3 dimensions, reduced effectively to 2. A helicopter in flight is a fully 3-dimensional problem, closing or opening distance at speed, changing altitude, banking, all while the drone operator tries to intercept a moving point in space with a device that has a battery life measured in minutes. Doing that with a homemade first-person racing drone was, for most of this war, considered close to impossible. It has now reportedly happened enough times that it looks less like an anomaly and more like an emerging capability. According to reporting from Ukrainian outlets and from Skyfall, the Ukrainian manufacturer whose drone was reportedly used in this strike, the weapon involved was a model called the Shrike 10, priced at around $400 per unit. Footage said to be from the engagement shows the drone closing in level with the helicopter before angling upward and striking it from above, a detail that matters because it suggests deliberate targeting rather than a lucky pass. Other reporting on the same strike and on comparable ones describes operators aiming specifically for the tail boom, the long rear section of the airframe that connects the main fuselage to the tail rotor. That is not a random point of impact. Helicopters are aerodynamically unforgiving machines. The main rotor generates lift and also torque, a twisting force that would send the aircraft spinning out of control if left uncorrected. The tail rotor exists purely to counteract that torque, to hold the airframe straight. Damage the tail rotor, or the boom and gearbox that drive it, and the helicopter does not necessarily explode or fall out of the sky in a fireball. It loses its ability to fly in a controlled straight line. It begins to yaw, then spin, and if the pilot cannot compensate quickly enough, the aircraft goes down. This is precisely the failure mode described in earlier drone strikes on Russian helicopters throughout this war, and it appears to be the same pattern here. A $400 drone does not need to punch through an armored cockpit to kill a multi-million-dollar aircraft. It only needs to find the one component that the airframe cannot function without, and that component, on a helicopter, is relatively exposed. Now, where did this happen, and why does that matter? Belgorod region sits directly across the international border from Ukraine's Kharkiv and Sumy regions, and it has functioned for most of this war as a rear staging area for Russian forces, a place from which artillery, glide bombs, and aviation sorties are launched into Ukrainian territory, generally on the assumption that Russian soil offers a measure of safety that the front line does not. That assumption has been eroding steadily since 2022, and this strike, if confirmed, is another crack in it. A helicopter destroyed not at the front, not in occupied Ukrainian territory, but inside Russia's own internationally recognized borders, using a short-range first-person view system, tells you something important about how compressed the operational depth of this war has become. Russian aviation units that once treated their own rear areas as a safe zone for staging, refueling, and transit flights now have to reckon with the possibility that Ukrainian reconnaissance and strike teams are operating, watching, and waiting inside or near that same territory. This is not the deep strike, long-range drone campaign that has hit refineries and airfields hundreds of kilometers from the border. This is something more immediate and, in some ways, more unsettling for Russian commanders. Short-range aerial ambush, conducted close enough to the border that a small quadcopter with a battery life of a few minutes can still reach its target. It's also worth putting a number on how unusual, or rather how unusual, this kind of strike has become. This was reportedly not the first time an Mi-28 has been destroyed or damaged by a Ukrainian drone, not the second, and not even the third. Go back to August of 2024, during Ukraine's incursion into Russia's Kursk region, and you find the case that some in Ukraine's security services called a unique moment in military history at the time. An operator from the security service of Ukraine's Special Operations Center struck a Mi-28 during a tactical landing using a long-range fixed-wing drone that cost around $1,000, hitting the tail rotor, and, according to sources at the time, marking the first recorded instance of a drone striking a helicopter in midair during this war. Move forward to September of 2025, and pilots from Ukraine's 59th Assault Brigade, operating under the same unmanned systems forces structure that Bravdy now commands, shot down another Mi-28N near the village of Kotlyarivka in Russian-occupied Donetsk region, again using an FPV drone, again reportedly using the same Shrike 10 model built by Skyfall. That Strike 2 was described in some reporting as a chase, the drone following the helicopter's flight path before catching it. Then in April of 2026, a combined team, this time drawn from Ukraine's 429th Brigade working alongside the 43rd Artillery Brigade, struck a Mi-28 and a Mi-8 transport helicopter together on the ground at a Russian airstrip in Voronezh region, more than 150 kilometers from the front line, deliberately targeting the rear engine compartments while avoiding the main rotor assembly to maximize the chance of a mission kill. And in March of this year, in a case that drew a great deal of attention because of the aircraft involved, operators from the 59th Brigade's Kizhaki Vysot unit shot down a Russian Ka-52 attack helicopter in flight over the Pokrovsk sector, using a fiber-optic guided FPV drone, in what was described as the first confirmed case of that particular aircraft type being destroyed by a drone while airborne anywhere in this war. Line those cases up, and a pattern comes into focus that goes well beyond any single claim about a single helicopter on a single morning in Belgorod. What you are looking at is a documented, repeating, and apparently improving capability, the ability of small, cheap first-person view drones to intercept, damage, and in a growing number of cases, fully destroy Russian military helicopters, including some of the most heavily armored attack helicopters in the Russian air fleet, across a widening range of operational contexts, from ground ambushes during landing, to strikes on parked aircraft at rear airfields, to genuine mid-air intercepts of moving targets at altitude. Each of those categories represents a harder technical problem than the last. Hitting a helicopter that has landed and shut down its engines is difficult, but conceptually similar to striking any stationary ground target. Hitting a helicopter during a tactical landing when it's low, slow, and momentarily predictable is harder. Hitting one at cruising altitude and speed in the open sky, tracking a moving three-dimensional target with a device that has to be flown manually or semi-autonomously by an operator working off a live video feed, is a different order of difficulty entirely. The fact that Ukrainian units now claim to have done all three repeatedly over the course of roughly 2 years tells you this is not a fluke. It is a maturing tactic, refined through what appears to be extensive preparation. In the case of the Ka-52 shot down in March, reporting indicated that preparation for that specific operation took around a month and a half. during which operators tracked Russian helicopter flight routes, logged altitude patterns and timing, and identified predictable corridors where attack aircraft would pass within range of a waiting drone team. That is not an improvised ambush. That is a targeting cycle that looks more like something out of an air defense doctrine textbook than a hobbyist drone video, which raises an obvious question. How does an unguided, battery-powered quadcopter, flown by a human being wearing video goggles, actually catch and hit an aircraft moving at well over 100 kilometers an hour? Part of the answer lies in exactly that preparation. Helicopters, unlike fixed-wing jets, tend to fly relatively low and relatively slow compared to their fixed-wing counterparts, often hugging terrain to avoid radar and man-portable air defense systems. That terrain-hugging behavior, ironically, is what makes them vulnerable to a threat that barely existed when the tactic was first developed: a short-range aerial ambush from a drone team that has prepositioned itself along a known or suspected flight corridor. If an operator knows roughly where and when a helicopter is likely to pass, based on patterns built from days or weeks of observation, they don't need to outfly the aircraft in an open chase. They need only to be airborne and positioned along that corridor, ready to accelerate into an intercept course the moment the target appears. Several of the reported engagements describe exactly this kind of behavior: the drone flying level with the helicopter, matching its course, before climbing and diving into the airframe from above or striking the tail section from behind. That is not a random collision. That is an intercept, executed by a human pilot under enormous time pressure, using a signal link that has to survive electronic jamming at a moment's notice against a target that is actively trying not to be there. And that brings us to the fiber optic detail, which deserves its own moment of explanation because it may be the single most important technical development underlying this entire trend. Russia has spent much of the past 2 years building out an increasingly dense electronic warfare umbrella along and near the front line, designed specifically to jam the radio frequencies that conventional FPV drones rely on to receive their control signals. For a while, that jamming genuinely blunted the effectiveness of first-person view drones in contested airspace, forcing operators to work within narrow, frequency-hopping windows or accept degraded control. The response, on the Ukrainian side, has been the rapid adoption of fiber optic-guided drones. Instead of a radio link, these systems trail a hair-thin spool of fiber optic cable behind them, physically connecting the drone to its operator's control unit. There is no signal to jam because there is no signal being broadcast at all. The trade-off is range, weight, and the mechanical fragility of unspooling cable at speed. But the payoff is a control link that is effectively immune to the electronic warfare environment that has increasingly dominated this battlefield. The manufacturer credited with the drone used in the March Ka-52 shootdown, a company that goes by the name General Chereshnya, had only just received official certification for that particular fiber optic model in December of last year. Its rapid deployment into a helicopter killing role within a matter of weeks illustrates just how fast the iteration cycle has become in this war. A capability moves from certification to combat use to a documented kill against one of Russia's most capable attack helicopters in under 3 months. Now, it's worth pausing here and applying some healthy skepticism, because that is what responsible analysis requires. These claims originate almost entirely from the Ukrainian side, specifically from Ukraine's own military command structure and from the commander of the unmanned systems forces personally, a man whose public persona is built substantially around publicizing precisely this kind of success. Robert Brovdi, callsign Magyar, has become one of the most visible and most quoted battlefield commanders of this war, in large part because he actively curates and releases combat footage, often with a distinctly mocking, almost gleeful tone toward Russian losses. That does not mean the claims are false. Ukraine has released video in most of these cases, and outside monitoring groups, along with open-source intelligence trackers, such as the Oryx project, which catalogs visually confirmed equipment losses on both sides of this war using photographic and video evidence rather than official statements, have independently documented a substantial number of Mi-28 and Ka-52 losses over the course of the conflict. According to figures attributed to that tracking effort, at least 20 Mi-28 attack helicopters, and separately, in a broader count that includes both destroyed and damaged airframes, a total that has been cited as high as 45 Mi-28s alongside 85 Ka-52s, have been visually confirmed lost or damaged since Russia's full-scale invasion began, with analysts noting that the true figure is almost certainly higher, since not every loss produces footage that surfaces publicly. So the broader trend, that Russian attack helicopters have suffered significant and escalating losses over the course of this war, and that drones have become an increasingly common cause of those losses, is well supported by evidence beyond any single claim from any single Ukrainian official. What remains harder to verify in the case of this specific Belgorod incident from July 15th is independent confirmation from Russian sources or neutral observers that this particular helicopter was destroyed rather than damaged. and that it was this specific drone and this specific unit responsible. Russian officials, for their part, have generally been far less forthcoming about their own aviation losses than Ukraine has been about its claimed successes, which is itself an asymmetry worth noting when weighing how this story is likely to be reported and remembered. It is also worth noting, for context, that Russian industry itself has effectively acknowledged the scale of this problem. Reporting from last October indicated that Russian helicopters, the state-owned manufacturer responsible for producing the Mi-28 and other rotary-wing aircraft, publicly confirmed it was developing new protective systems, specifically in response to the mounting toll that Ukrainian FPV drones had taken on Russian rotorcraft. That is a significant admission. It is one thing for an adversary to claim battlefield success. It is another for the manufacturer of the targeted equipment to publicly commit engineering resources to defending against the specific threat being claimed. Whatever the exact tally of confirmed versus claimed losses in any individual case, the pattern has clearly registered inside Russia's own defense industrial establishment as a real and growing vulnerability, not a Ukrainian propaganda narrative that can simply be dismissed. Step back from the individual claim about Vyazovoi for a moment and look at what this represents in the broader arc of the war, because that is really where the significance lies. For most of the 20th century and into the 21st, air power, and rotary wing air power in particular, operate under an assumption embedded deep in military doctrine that helicopters, while vulnerable to dedicated air defense systems, man-portable missiles, and enemy fighter aircraft, were essentially safe from any threat an individual infantry soldier could carry or improvise on short notice. A helicopter flying at altitude, at speed, executing evasive maneuvers, was simply too fast and too far away for a foot soldier to threaten with anything short of a guided missile system costing tens of thousands of dollars and requiring specialized training to operate. That assumption is now, demonstrably, no longer safe to make. What Ukraine's unmanned systems forces appear to have built over roughly 2 years of iterative development is a genuinely new category of threat. A cheap, mass-producible, rapidly evolving aerial intercept capability that did not exist in any meaningful form at the start of this war, and that now threatens one of the most expensive and most doctrinally important categories of military hardware in any modern army's inventory. Attack helicopters exist specifically to provide close air support, to hunt armor, to give ground commanders a flexible, fast response strike capability that doesn't require the runway infrastructure or lengthy scramble times of fixed-wing jets. If that category of aircraft can be reliably threatened by $400 drones flown by operators who may have only weeks of training, the economics and the doctrine underlying an enormous portion of 20th century military aviation begin to look genuinely unstable. Consider the raw cost asymmetry involved, because it is almost impossible to overstate. Estimates for the cost of a single Mi-28 range from roughly $15 to $19 million per unit, depending on the configuration and the source of the estimate. A K-52, meanwhile, has been valued in various reports at around $16 million as well. The drone reportedly used to destroy the helicopter in Belgorod cost around $400. That is not a rounding error in a defense budget. That is a cost ratio on the order of 40,000 to 1, even accounting for the fact that a successful strike requires an enormous amount of unpaid or lightly compensated human capital, the training of operators, the reconnaissance effort behind identifying flight patterns, the broader logistics of Ukraine's drone production ecosystem, the fundamental economics, still favor the side fielding the drones overwhelmingly. And that production ecosystem, it's worth noting, has scaled dramatically over the course of this war. Ukrainian officials, including President Volodymyr Zelensky, have stated that the country is now producing around 10 million drones annually, with an ambition to reach 20 million with continued foreign support. And separate reporting has described a deal involving Germany financing 50,000 additional FPV drones for Ukraine, manufactured with autonomous targeting software supplied by an American technology firm, in an agreement worth roughly $100 million. None of that production figure refers exclusively to anti-helicopter systems. The overwhelming majority of Ukraine's drone output is still aimed at armor, artillery, logistics, and personnel on the ground, but it establishes the industrial base from which specialized helicopter hunting teams like the Rarog Brigade and the 59th Assault Brigade's Kizaki Visat unit can be resourced, refined, and expanded. There is a broader lesson here about how asymmetric warfare evolves inside a prolonged, high-intensity conflict between technologically comparable adversaries, which is unusual in itself, since much of the literature on asymmetric warfare was written with insurgencies and counterinsurgencies in mind, not two conventional state militaries slugging it out along a fixed front line for years on end. What seems to be happening in the skies over Belgorod and over Donetsk and over Voronezh is less like a traditional air war and more like a hunting relationship, in which one side has essentially given up trying to match the other's aircraft for aircraft investment, and has instead built a decentralized, rapidly iterating network of small, disposable interceptors, operated by specialized units who study Russian aviation behavior the way naturalists study animal migration patterns, waiting along known corridors, adapting their tactics generation by generation as Russian countermeasures evolve and as Ukrainian drone technology evolves in response. That loop, threat and countermeasure and countermeasure, cycling in a matter of months rather than years, is itself one of the defining features of this war, and one that most Western militaries, built around procurement cycles measured in a decade or more, are watching very closely. Because whatever holds true on this particular battlefield will almost certainly shape how the next generation of air defense doctrine gets written everywhere else. It's also worth situating this single strike within the broader operational picture from the same week, because Ukraine's unmanned systems forces have not been focused solely on helicopters. In the same window of time, Brovdy and his command publicized a wave of strikes against Russian military and economic infrastructure, including an attack on the Syzran oil refinery, strikes on 10 tankers and 4 ferries, and what Ukrainian officials described as a new phase of a maritime drone operation targeting Russia's so-called shadow fleet, the aging tanker vessels used to move sanctioned Russian oil around Western restrictions, with claims of strikes against as many as 20 vessels in a single night in the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. Whatever the precise, verified toll of that maritime campaign turns out to be, the pattern is consistent. Ukraine's drone forces, both aerial and maritime, are running a sustained, multi-domain campaign designed to raise the cost of the war for Russia across every category of military and economic asset they can reach, from attack helicopters near the border to oil tankers far out at sea. The helicopter strike near Vyazovoye is not an isolated headline. It is one data point inside a much larger, deliberately publicized campaign of attrition, in which Ukraine appears to be betting that its ability to out-innovate and outproduce cheap unmanned systems can offset Russia's advantages in manpower, artillery volume, and territorial depth. None of this should be read as a suggestion that the war is somehow close to resolution because of one destroyed helicopter, or even because of the broader pattern of helicopter losses this represents. Russia continues to operate a large fleet of Mi-28s, Ka-52s, and other rotary wing aircraft, continues to produce replacements, and continues to fly combat sorties along the front, despite the mounting risk. Losses on the order of dozens of airframes, however damaging to a specific unit's capability or to a pilot corps that takes years to train, are not by themselves decisive in a war of this scale and duration. What they do represent is a steady compounding tax on Russian aviation, one that forces costly adaptations, that likely constrains how aggressively Russian commanders are willing to use their attack helicopters near contested or forward areas, and that adds to a long list of ways in which Ukraine has managed to impose disproportionate costs on a numerically larger opponent through low-cost, high-ingenuity unmanned systems. It also reinforces something that has become one of the defining features of how this war gets communicated to the outside world. Nearly every claimed engagement on either side is now documented, filmed, and published within hours, transforming what was once the fog of war into something closer to a running, if heavily curated, highlight reel, in which battlefield claims spread and shape public perception long before, and sometimes entirely without, independent verification ever catching up. So where does that leave us in assessing this particular claim about a Mi-28 going down near Vyazovoye on the morning of July 15th? The specific details, the unit involved, the location, the approximate time, the manufacturer of the drone reportedly used, are consistent across multiple independent Ukrainian and international outlets that picked up the story within hours of Brovdy's original announcement. And the tactical pattern described fits closely with a well-documented multi-year trend of Ukrainian drone units successfully targeting Russian helicopters using broadly similar methods. That consistency lends the claim real credibility, even without independent Russian confirmation, which, given the general reluctance of Russian officials to acknowledge aviation losses in something close to real time, may simply never arrive in a form that satisfies the strictest standard of outside verification. What can be said with confidence is this: whether or not this exact airframe was destroyed outright or merely damaged, whether the pilot survived or did not, the broader capability being demonstrated here is real, has been independently corroborated across dozens of separate engagements over roughly 2 years, has been acknowledged as a serious problem by the Russian helicopter industry itself, and represents one of the more significant tactical innovations to emerge from this war: the transformation of a mass-produced, consumer-derived quadcopter into a credible threat against some of the most heavily protected aircraft any modern military fields. That is the real story behind the headline about one helicopter near one village in Belgorod on one Wednesday morning in July. It is not really a story about a single aircraft at all. It is a story about how quickly and how cheaply the balance of power in the sky over a modern battlefield can shift when someone works out how to turn a $400 toy into a weapon capable of bringing down a $19 million machine. There's a further layer to this worth drawing out, which is what it says about the people actually doing the work, because it's easy to talk about drones and airframes and cost ratios and lose sight of the fact that every one of these engagements is still, fundamentally, a human being sitting somewhere in a trench, a basement, or a forward position, wearing a set of video goggles, flying a machine they cannot see with their own eyes toward a target moving at highway speed through open sky. That is an extraordinary skill to develop, and it did not exist as a military occupational specialty anywhere in the world 5 years ago. Ukraine has effectively had to invent a new branch of soldiering from scratch, in real time, under fire, and then scale it fast enough to matter at a theater-wide level. The Unmanned Systems Forces, as a distinct branch of Ukraine's military, did not exist in its current form until relatively recently in the course of this war, and the fact that a dedicated regiment like the 427th Rurog now has enough institutional maturity, training pipeline, and operational history to be credited by name repeatedly for high-value kills like this one tells you something about how fast Ukraine has had to professionalize what began in the war's earlier years as a scattered, improvised, almost hobbyist effort involving repurposed racing drones and volunteers with soldering irons. It's also worth thinking about what this means for the Russian side of the ledger beyond just the loss of a single airframe. Every attack helicopter pilot in the Russian military represents years of training and an enormous sunk cost that cannot simply be replaced by rolling a new airframe off a production line. If a helicopter goes down and the crew survives, that is one outcome. If the crew does not survive, and several of the previous engagements described here, including the March strike on the Ka-52 near Pokrovsk, describe follow-on drones tracking and striking crew members after they escape the wreckage on foot, then Russia loses not just a machine, but 2 trained aviators who likely cannot be replaced on anything close to the timeline needed to replace the airframe itself. That is arguably a more significant strategic cost than the dollar value of the helicopter, and it may help explain why Russian aviation units have reportedly become more cautious about how and where they fly attack helicopters near contested sectors, favoring higher altitudes, shorter exposure windows, and tighter operational security around flight timing, even though none of those adaptations fully neutralizes the threat. Since, as the Vyazovoye strike and the Voronezh airfield strike both suggest, Ukrainian units have shown they can reach helicopters both in the air and on the ground, both near the front and well behind it. Zoom out one more time. Past this individual claim, past even the broader campaign of drone strikes against Russian aviation, and you arrive at the question every military planner outside this war is now quietly asking: if a determined, resource-constrained force can build this capability from almost nothing in roughly 2 years, using commercially available components, hobbyist-derived airframes, and a rapidly iterating domestic production base, what does that mean for the next conflict involving attack helicopters anywhere else in the world? The answer that seems to be emerging from the skies over Belgorod, and from the string of similar engagements before it, is that the era in which a helicopter's speed and altitude alone guaranteed its safety from anything short of a dedicated expensive air defense system may already be ending. Whether or not this exact helicopter on this exact morning, near this exact village, was destroyed precisely as described, the trend line behind the claim is no longer in serious dispute. Cheap drones are killing expensive helicopters with increasing frequency in increasingly difficult tactical conditions, and every military that fields rotary wing aircraft is now taking notes.